The single most predictive factor for whether a higher ed merger succeeds is not the spreadsheet, it's the leadership. And most higher ed leaders running a merger today haven't done this before.
Hit it! That's what I'm talking about. Wait!
Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
Welcome to Higher Ed Pulse, your no-fluff guide to artificial intelligence in higher ed. I'm Mallory, bringing nearly 20 years of edtech and marketing expertise straight to your earbuds. Higher ed leaders are expected to master AI overnight, but let's be real, no one has time to sift through every headline, hot take, or research report. That's why every Monday I'll break down what actually matters, fast, clear, and to the point. Want to sound like the smartest person in the room at your next team meeting? You're in the right place. Let's dive in. Welcome back to Higher Ed Pulse. On today's episode, $175 million surprise, a vote of no confidence, colleagues calling each other Kool-Aid drinkers. My guests studied 3 higher ed mergers, and the leadership stories inside them are wild. Today, I am joined by Dr. Morgan Johnson, VP of Academic Experience at the University of Arizona Global Campus, and one of the very few people in higher ed who has studied merger leadership from the inside. Morgan just defended her dissertation at Penn, Leading Through Change, exploring competencies in higher education leaders in mergers and acquisitions. She interviewed 21 senior leaders across 3 completed mergers and got them on the record about what held, what broke, and what their training never prepared them for. Morgan, welcome to the Pulse.
Well, thank you so much, Mallory. I'm glad to be here.
And congratulations on defending your dissertation back in April. I'm sure that is quite a relief to be done.
Thank you. It's a huge relief. This is actually the first time since defense I'm talking about my research. So excited to have the conversation with you today.
I feel like we've got the exclusive. I love it. Now that you have all this time on your hands, what are you doing this summer?
I think I'm, making up for time during dissertation now with family. I have 3 kids, so we are at the ballpark, football field, soccer field, every single day with them, and just hoping to enjoy and not think about any kind of homework and writing.
And you told me your oldest are twin boys who are learning to drive. Yes. I wish you the best of luck this summer with 2 of them.
Thank
oh my
you.
gosh.
Oh my. It's the only thing and the thing they're most excited about. And I can't wait till it's over. My husband actually does all of the driving with them because it's just too anxiety ridden.
Yeah. Well, let's pivot into our conversation today. Last year, a higher ed merger was announced roughly once a month. Add in the schools that are kind of secretly considering one or actually closing, and that number jumps to an announcement a week. Most of the conversation around this lives in the boardroom. It's pricing pressure or the enrollment cliff, tuition dependency, endowment math. It all gets framed as a structural and financial story. But Morgan's research says that's the wrong frame. She spent 3 years studying 3 completed mergers and interviewing 21 senior leaders about what they actually leaned on when their institutions merged. What she found is that the single most predictive factor for whether a higher ed merger succeeds is not the spreadsheet, it's the leadership. And most higher ed leaders running a merger today haven't done this before. So the question becomes, when you're learning on the job and the institution is on the line, what holds you up? And Morgan has the answer. She found 4 competencies that matter, 15 sub-skills, and she's got 3 case studies, including one where a $175 million surprise, a vanishing president, and a vote of no confidence reveal exactly what happens when the leadership layer doesn't hold. Morgan, we're going to start there. The conversation around higher ed M&A right now is almost entirely financial. It's all about that enrollment cliff or the tuition pressure. And your research argues leadership qualities of key actors is actually the single most predictive factor for whether a merger succeeds. Make the case for us. Why is leadership the variable that nobody is seeing?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to make that case. I think the financial pressures are real. So I don't want to discount what every probably institutional board and leader conversation centers around to some degree, which to your point, enrollment pressures, looking at shifts in demographics for lots of institutions, tuition considerations. I mean, that is key, but that is the conditions in which hundreds of institutions are having conversations every day that don't necessarily lead to mergers. And of those that are engaged within the merger process itself, the finances alone are not predictors of if the merger will be successful ultimately, because they're not just operational transitions, right? I think when we look at M&A in other industries in particular, they're very operationally focused. But when you're looking at higher ed, one of the things that sets higher ed institutions apart from M&A in other areas is that consideration of institutional mission, culture, and really the people who make up the institution itself, the faculty, students, and communities at large. So if leaders are not able to manage through those cultural shifts, and if they are only focused on operational considerations like finances, truly mergers will not be successful. And that's really what came through in conversations with leaders across the 3 cases that I looked at.
So let's dig into one of those cases, the Summit story. Let's go there. Tell us what happened.
It was one of the most interesting cases that I looked at across all 3 of the merger instances, namely because, as you noted in your opening, there were a lot of variables that made this a very challenging situation for leaders to manage through. You know, it started out, for all intents and purposes, as a quote unquote normal merger, although I think we could all agree, like, there is not really a normal merger. They're all very different in and of themselves. But this one in particular, it looks like a great strategic partnership between 2 institutions that were not on paper at the beginning of the merger process, looking like they were in financial strain. They were looking to diversify really their academic portfolio. And there was a lot of complementary aspects to what a partnership could look like. But shortly after getting into the merger process, including, you know, approval by boards and starting to go through the change management process within each institution, it came very clear quickly based on leaders' descriptions of the process that it was anything, I would say, but normal. Starting with like the initial approval from their accreditors, the president of Summit announced she was leaving, and that coincided the exact day accreditor approval came through. So, you know, I think one of the interesting pieces across all 3 mergers was the importance that presidents played in leadership stability and leading their institutional communities through major change. In particular, though, for this one, the announcement of a president leaving at such a critical milestone of the merger process kind of set into motion a lot of challenges moving forward with trust and communication, and the lack of an anchor of having a leader at that level help navigate a really complex change for the institution. Additionally, after the president left at Summit, what was not discovered through, shockingly, I would say, through due diligence process on the front end was that Summit was also dealing with a $175 million operating deficit. So that definitely put them in a different financial position. And given that they were the acquiring institution, I would say instantaneously, based on what leaders described, it hurt trust in the process. It hurt trust with leaders who were managing on both sides, and just created even more complexity, right, than the merger already was introducing.
And I think you also wrote that the Summit campus thought this was a merger, but Eastbridge thought it was an acquisition, and like no one fixed that mismatch. And that feels like that could not have positively benefited all of this either.
No, I think that's such like a key element to pick up. I mean, generally in higher education, we say merger. It's very rare in an actual merger and acquisition that you will hear the institutions refer to it as a merger and acquisition. And kind of through conversations with, you know, leaders, but also just through the literature, I think that relates back to this notion of institutional mission and identity. The notion that you're going to partner with someone, but still hold those institutional values that make you who you are and partner to expand that really is an innately critical and important aspect for most leaders of boards, institutions going through a change like this. So in this particular case, although they use the language of merger, the behaviors and actions and really decision making, what was reflected was that it was an acquisition. And so although communications were, hey, we're entering into a merger, a partnership together, this benefits both institutions for a variety of reasons. That's not how folks felt they were treated, or the autonomy, ability they had in their roles as leaders to actually execute the merger. So I would just say, like, one of the key findings was, like, language is important. So if you're saying it's a merger, your actions should match that. And if they don't, that's going to create a ripple effect for all communities that are impacted through the merger.
So let's go to your framework. I love a framework. And you landed on 4 core competencies that leaders rely on during M&A: communication and transparency, emotional intelligence, strategic management, and mission stewardship. Give us a quick tour.
These are the 4 like top or key or primary competencies that came through in leader interviews. So communication and transparency, no surprise, right? I mean, you would ask anyone kind of managing through a major change, and they would likely say, like, this is a top and critical competency. So this was not a surprise. I think as we got into the complexity of what communication and transparency looked like with mergers and acquisitions, the communication to a multitude of stakeholders became clear, because presidents, their cabinets, key strategic leaders at the institution boards are managing internal and external groups, regulators, potentially like state oversight over the institution, as well as active students, alumni, folks, right, that have really key connections and investment in the institution. And so communication was key, in addition to internal stakeholders, of course, such as faculty and staff. But that the piece I think that became clear quickly was transparency, in that the more transparent, especially at a presidential, and cabinet level, the more transparent leaders were, the more successful they tended to be. So, and it wasn't that they always had the answers, right? And that was part of being transparent, and that we don't know. But what I heard on several occasions was, here's when we expect to know, here's what we are waiting for, here's how we will manage things until we do understand, what actions are being taken or what we need to do. And lots of folks said, like, that transparency was key to building trust among stakeholders and ensuring that they could successfully navigate through really significant times of unknown, right, aspects of the merger. And that was often related to employees wondering, do I have a job in the future? Or students wondering, will my major continue, right? Like, very personal things to stakeholders that leaders had to manage through this process.
Was there one of the 4 that was maybe surprising, or like maybe you didn't expect it to surface as much as it did?
I think really emotional intelligence, again, maybe not a surprise to come through when you're dealing with change management at the scale introduced during a merger and acquisition, but emotional intelligence in that human considerations really for every step, every decision had to be front and center. And if they weren't, there were truly unintentional impacts that would occur. And I would say, leaders not only considering like how to approach hard conversations, difficult, challenging decisions, but also in how they took care of themselves, how they showed up for peer leaders. That came through in a strong way. And most leaders I spoke with had shared that there really wasn't, outside of their immediate peer groups in particular, there wasn't support that they had through such significant and complex change that they were managing. So emotional intelligence became a key element of leadership for each of them, truly.
That makes sense. So, all right, I'm going to ask you to defend a line in your dissertation now. You wrote leaders' attributes matter more than their prior merger experience. And that's a pretty big claim. I mean, yes, we've been talking about these core competencies, but if I'm on a board, like my filter is probably to go find somebody who has done this before. And you're telling me that's the wrong filter. So, what is the right filter?
Well, and I wouldn't say it's entirely the wrong filter. I would say experience with mergers and more importantly, managing significant change. And that's really where I think I saw leaders diverge. And there were leaders I spoke with, right, that had merger experience at prior institutions or even in one instance within their own institution, but they were in very different roles, right? And not necessarily leading significant numbers of employees and students through the merger at that time. So while there was I think what folks refer to as the merger muscle, that often tapped into technical elements of mergers, which are critical. And so that experience did help them navigate through, what are the regulatory steps we need to go through, or from a financial modeling perspective, what might we want to put on paper to make some of these decisions, but not necessarily through how do we build trust among stakeholders? How do we effectively communicate to all the individuals that need specific types of information in different ways and different times? How do we care for one another and show up in a way that helps support some of the emotions that are being felt through a change like this? While that merger muscle is important, alone, it's not enough to effectively, I think, make a decision about who's the best leader for the job, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And let's stay on the topic of leaders because you also found that presidential stability is one of the bigger differentiators across the three cases that you looked at. And we talked about Eastbridge and Summit and how they lost their presidents and kind of, the wheels came off as a result. Elmwood, on the other hand, their president stayed in the seat and the team seemed to lead with a lot of cohesion and emotional intelligence to what we've been discussing. So how much of a merger success is like simply does your president stick around? And, from the sense of timing, like do boards need to be considering this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And maybe not a surprise, but something that came through strongly with each of the cases I looked at, in that presidential stability is absolutely critical, and transparency around the role of the president in the merger and what that might look like at different stages in the merger. I don't think we can easily say, hey, if a president stays, the merger is going to be successful. But in instances where there was quick and unanticipated exits from presidents, or the president's role shifted in a way that was unexpected during the merger process, that created significant instability for the next level of leaders and impacted their ability to effectively lead. I think additionally, just generally for communities, right, presidents are anchors. So seeing someone working and talking through significant, change decisions, or hearing from them, right, when decisions are made, that's important for campuses to consider. And I think to your question, boards do need to consider as they're making decisions about mergers, do they have the right leaders in place to help manage through them? And if the answer to that is yes, how do they retain those individuals at least through certain aspects or periods of the merger process?
And how do they take care of their leaders is the next thread I want to pull, because you did find some confessions of self-care as you spoke and interviewed folks. A number of people said, and one, Director Peterson actually asked, if you are not good, how can you lead other people to be good? And so what a human thread in your research, right? Leaders saying the self-recognition, I need to take care of myself, but I often put this last. What did you learn about leadership and self-care in this process? And, what are leaders maybe not getting from their institutions?
Yeah, this is, I think such an important question and consideration just for institutions, not even that are managing through mergers and acquisitions, but just major change in general, is that leaders, they're expected to really be front and center at all points, resilient, leading large teams through change and being successful. And they often don't have support structures, intentional support structures, maybe I'll frame it, in place to help work through those types of changes. And so what I heard from interview participants, well, number one, it's the first time several of them essentially had even talked about the merger that they had gone through. And self kind of reported they never were asked, how are you feeling? What was this process like for you? And so I think like the number one thing I would say is there needs to be some built-in opportunities for like reflection in spaces where institutions that are going through major change can say, like, what are we hearing from our leaders? And then what do we need to address gaps that might be in place? I, had shared earlier that a lot of the gaps, so to speak, or the supports were filled by peers. And I think that was both like an internal kind of support system that leaders sought out, but also peers from externally that had gone through major change at their own institutions that they reported feeling safe talking to, right? I heard on several instances, like, I can't really, or I couldn't really talk to folks internally about this because that may make me seem like I'm not feeling confident about something that I am in charge of leading through. So I needed to seek supports outside of my internal structure to do so. So I think, I don't know that there's an easy answer for this, but I think just having some of these conversations and creating those structures where leaders feel safe and do feel like they can talk about what's going on is critical. And, I think leaders need to also self-manage that a bit too. The quote you pulled out, like, it's leaders realize, right, it's critical for them to feel good, to be in a good space and to have outlets like that. And they're never prioritize it, right? Because they are prioritizing their people, their students, their faculty through these changes that they're managing through. And ultimately, I think one of the leaders that like it most resonated with me said, after the merger and after my transition to another institution, I had to take essentially like a 2-month period where I decompressed and I just kind of got back to, like a spot where I could jump into another spot where I was required to lead.
Wow. So where are the consultants in all of this? Because I know they're somewhere. What did your research tell you about what consultants do and don't do in this process?
First and foremost, I would say that I love all of my consultant friends out there. And so this is not to say consultants are not a critical part of the process, but what I did hear from leaders is, number one, where they felt like they lacked some level of internal capacity. Generally, that sat on the front end of the merger process. And so that was with things that, right, the teams in place at institutions or boards were not experienced in themselves in terms of the financial considerations, legal supports potentially, some of the regulatory pieces they had to work through. But really from a board perspective, I think where there's higher risk, right? And that's where lots of boards and institutions bring consultants in really prior to that decision of the merger being made. So it's not to manage through the change itself, but it's to help inform the decision. Are we going to enter into a merger or not? And so I think, not to say that consultants aren't, an important part of the merger process, but not necessarily post-decision and change management. And could they be? Potentially. And I think, the conversation around consultants, though, largely was that, could you bring in a consultant that really wasn't familiar with an institution's culture to help leaders lead through the types of change you have to during a merger and acquisition? That's not a question, right, that I was seeking to answer.
Right.
So I think it's something that could be explored. And where can consultants potentially like find value and institutions find value in consultants in that process?
Interesting. So I'm a VP of enrollment or I'm a CMO and I am listening to this episode right now. And then later this afternoon, I get pulled into my president's office and I find out my institution is in early merger talks. Based on everything you have learned, what do I do in my first 30 days and what do I definitely not do?
I think some people, right, would celebrate that question like, oh, yes, this is a challenge, something I want to take on, and probably it's a frightening question for other leaders to think about. I would say based on, the leaders that I spoke to during this process, they immediately went to operational considerations. Naturally, right? That's, I think, what all of us would do as it relates to some of those more like technical considerations, especially depending on your role and kind of set of responsibilities. But what I would say is, the merger process is largely, it's really the humans that you're helping to navigate through this major change. So the first part of your focus should be relational and consider the people and, understand the team you're going to have around you leading through this process. Understand, which stakeholders you're responsible to and vice versa. I would also say having a clear understanding of roles and responsibility in the process for institutions is also a must-have. The institutions that seem to have, I would say, the most success were very clear in having a centralized structure. Everyone understood their role and responsibility in that structure as it related to the merger. There were clear kind of points of who makes decisions, when are things elevated, how are updates being communicated up, down, and out. So I think that structure very quickly in the process is important to have in place. And then I think the last is just the listening and relational piece of this, right? You are entering into a new relationship with a new institution. So getting to know them, understanding who they are, their mission, their identity is key. And building those relationships from day one is critical. And listening and not just necessarily being quick to make decisions without understanding how those decisions are going to impact the groups that you're leading.
That's great advice. So last question for you, Morgan. You've talked to more than 20 leaders about like the hardest thing that they've probably ever done professionally. What is the one thing that higher ed as a field just still gets wrong about mergers and acquisitions? This is certainly something that's only going to continue and probably continue at a higher rate. So what do we need to fix?
I do think there's such different situational considerations in every merger and acquisition, right? Context, what led to the merger and acquisition. But I do think that the decision and approval related to the merger and acquisition is actually the very start of the process. And so I think we talk a lot about, the official milestones, the announcements that occur, and really the majority of the work happens after those announcements. And so I think it's critical for, as we're talking, as higher ed leaders, and how do we effectively manage the next waves of mergers and acquisitions that are going to occur, is it's not really the decision, it's what happens after and how leaders effectively ensure that those are successful. As you noted in some of the statistics you shared early on, a ton of institutions going through mergers right now. So we have so much, I think, to ask at the end, within 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of those mergers occurring, how things are going, and really understanding like what are making those successful versus not.
Your answer just like instantly put me back in my crisis comms grad class. Like, the overlap between like the advice you just gave and the tenets of good crisis communications and how you manage it. It's like so parallel. And so now I'm just thinking like mergers and acquisitions, I guess, are like maybe a bullet under a crisis, right? So that makes sense. Anyway.
Well, and no. I think in the competency kind of set that I found, mergers and acquisitions are often the answer to crisis as well on campuses. So there is absolutely like a crisis management element to it.
Wow. Well, Morgan, this was terrific. Thank you so much for opening that dissertation back up and giving us a preview of everything that you have learned. I feel so lucky that we were able to have you on the pulse. Listeners, before you go, if you are listening to this episode like the day or the week that it drops, like the Element 451 Engage Summit is happening right now. And do not worry, because if you go to engage.element451.com, you can still sign up for the free digital pass. You'll get access to exclusive recordings from the summit. You'll be able to join some of the sessions throughout the summer. And, really, it's all about AI. It's all about AI in action, and what is coming next with Agentic. And so run, don't walk, engage.element451.com. Morgan, where can folks find you if they want to pepper you with more questions about your dissertation?
Please, I would love that. LinkedIn is the best place. Feel free to reach out. And yeah.
I will drop a link to Morgan's LinkedIn profile in our show notes, folks, so you can connect with her immediately. Morgan, thanks again. And listeners, we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mallory.
Thanks for listening to the Higher Ed Pulse. The show is a proud member of the Enrollify Network, home to Higher Ed's largest collection of podcasts. Enrollify is where higher ed goes to grow. So be sure to check out our other podcasts, webinars, video clips, blogs, and more. Visit Enrollify.org and subscribe for all the latest details and content drops directly to your inbox. Enrollify is brought to you by Element 451, the digital workforce platform for higher ed. Learn more at element451.com.